All right, Sean, you are good to go.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am so honored today to be joined by my friend, my colleague, my occasional travel partner, Congresswoman Terri Sewell from Montgomery, Selma, Alabama region. We put this program together. This has been a long time in the making, and this really started in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests and George Floyd, and trying to do what we can to try to explain to folks what we are doing around making sure that everybody has an equal voice in our democracy, and hear from you on your concerns as well. Now, we didn't know that when we finally got this all together, we'd be in the wake of a lot of litigation around what's happening in Georgia and some other states as far as changing the rules. But as Congresswoman Sewell and I were saying at the start, this is unfortunately a topic that is always timely. So we're here to talk really about, we've got two big bills we're working through right now. One is HR 1 that we've passed on the House floor, which is broadly a good government bill, campaign finance reform, getting rid of gerrymandering, ethics, starting to undo Citizens United. And then separately, a bill that we passed last term but haven't yet passed this term, HR 4, which is ultimately, let's be honest, around getting rid of our original sin. A lot of the discriminatory racial issues that have gone on and consistently frustrated the ability for all voices in this country to be heard. And I claim I read books about it, but Terri Sewell is the architect of that bill, having been sworn in I guess, 2010, introduced the bill in 2014 and pushing it through, leading with our dear friend and former colleague, John Lewis, and it's now been rebranded the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And so, Terri, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to sit back and take notes while you teach us about HR 4 and why it's so necessary. And then I'll chat for a little bit and we'll put answers in the question. For those of you who have questions, please put them in the chat, whatever format you're listening on, and we'll read them off once we get in. But Terri, thanks again, and the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, Sean, thank you so much for the invitation. I want to let all of your constituents know that they are well represented in Illinois' 6th Congressional District. You've been such an important voice in Congress with your background in clean energy and your science background. I think that the reality is that we need more scientists and people who really understand the facts of the science in order to really address climate change. And you've been doing this as your career before you came to Congress, and you've been such a force in Congress on those issues. And I just want to thank you and let your constituents know how very well respected you are by so many of our colleagues, and how influential your voice is in that space. And so thank you again for allowing me to speak. I'm Congresswoman Terri Sewell. I represent Alabama's 7th district. It's a civil rights district. It includes Birmingham, Montgomery, Tuscaloosa, Roll Tide for any of those SEC fans out there. And it also includes my hometown of Selma, Alabama, which is where I am broadcasting live from right as we speak. I'm visiting my mother. So when I think about pivotal issues that are facing this country. We know that we are living through a global pandemic threatening our lives, affecting our livelihoods, but we've also seen over the past year threats to our democracy. And now more than ever, I think is an opportunity for us to try to address some of those disparities. When I think about voter discrimination, I think about old battles, the battles that John Lewis fought. But while you no longer have to count how many marbles are in a jar in order to register to vote, the efforts that are afoot by many states currently, and that have been since the Shelby versus Holder decision in 2013 gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, are no less pernicious. These current voter laws that try to restrict access to the ballot box are just as pernicious and just as bad. Old battles have indeed become new again. If you had ever told me that I would, as a member of Congress, 5 decades after John Lewis was bludgeoned on a bridge in my hometown, that my cause would be the cause that he fought for so much, and those foot soldiers did, who marched and died and bled for the right to vote, for the equal right to vote, I would have told you you were kidding. That how could it be that 56 years after Bloody Sunday, we are still fighting to ensure access to the ballot box by all Americans. And so I am honored to be the lead sponsor for HR 4, which, as Sean has said, we've renamed the John Robert Lewis Voting Advancement Act. And we are working right now with the Judiciary Committee and with the House Admin Committee, Subcommittee on Elections, to host a series of hearings to really continue to build the case that federal oversight is still needed. Just a pin before I go on with HR 4, the reason why HR 4 is necessary is because of the Shelby versus Holder decision. The state of Alabama brought us the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was because of the bravery and the courage of those marchers who dared to stand up and put a mirror in front of the faces of our, Constitution, and to challenge the Constitution's saying of, equal rights under the law and justice for all. It was because of their sheer bravery on that bridge that we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was because of Bloody Sunday and the world seeing how vicious the Alabama National Guard was against these marchers who simply peacefully were protesting the right to vote. That got us the Voting Rights Act. Well, it was Shelby County, Alabama, that filed a lawsuit. And in 2013, the Supreme Court found Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act to be unconstitutional. So what is Section 4? Section 4 was the formula by which the federal government determined which states were the most grievous violators of voter discrimination. And Section 5 was the remedy. So if you are a bad actor, a really bad actor, when it comes to voting rights, the remedy was Section 5, pre-clearance, that any laws, election laws that state or that jurisdiction promulgates has to be pre-cleared by the Federal Justice Department. And so while Section 5 is still very much alive in the Voting Rights Act, only Congress can put Section 4 back in. And the Supreme Court in the Shelby versus Holder decision, the majority opinion was written by the Chief Judge, Chief Justice Roberts. And he said that Congress was, in 2013, with an African-American president of the United States and record voting by African-Americans in order to elect him in 2008, that Congress was using outdated data, that Congress was penalizing states for what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so Congress needed to throw out the old formula, which was the same formula by which they determined those 16 jurisdictions in previous reauthorizations. What people need to realize is that had Shelby versus Holder not occurred, Sean, we would still be living under the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was reauthorized 5 times after 1965 under both Republican and Democratic presidents. In fact, the last time it was reauthorized was in 2006. And that was under George W. Bush's tenure. And in fact, during the 50th anniversary of the March from Selma to Montgomery, there were 2 presidents that were on that bridge commemorating the 50th anniversary. There was President Barack Obama, but President Bush and Laura Bush came back. Why? Because he was proud of the fact that they reauthorized the Voting Rights Act for 25 years in 2006, overwhelmingly passed the House and overwhelmingly passed the Senate. In fact, only 5 people didn't vote for it. But now we flash forward and all of a sudden we see Republicans resisting upholding the Voting Rights Act. And so when the Supreme Court said Congress needed to come up with a new formula, they put the onus squarely on the House of Representatives and the Senate to come up with a modern day formula. And what HR 4 is that formula. So we are currently building the case for HR 4. As I was telling Sean earlier, the bill that we passed last Congress, which I thought was a solidly great bill, it had a 25-year look back and required states to have 10 or more statewide violations in order for that state to be opted in and have to require pre-clearance of any of its election laws before they could be implemented. And so, I think that we all know that the Supreme Court now is a 6-3 very hostile court to these kinds of voting rights cases. And so it's going to be incumbent upon us to really build a very strong case for federal oversight and to really be able to justify, Congress to be able to justify the look back year and the number of violations. And so we're going to be turning to the experts, Sean, like we did before, to hear from them as to how we can get a narrowly tailored formula that will get at the most egregious actors who have violated that. And frankly, what we've seen now in states like Georgia, currently we have over 41 states across the United States right now are looking at over 250 restrictive voting laws. We saw Georgia just 2 weeks ago pass the most restrictive voting laws. And this is arguably at a time when Georgia, after the 2020 presidential election, had the highest voter turnout ever, had 2 recounts, withstood lots of litigation in court cases around the country that the Trump administration filed, that the Trump campaign filed. And by all accounts, we had the most secure election in America's history. But now we're seeing all of these states try to add more pernicious voting restrictions. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 requires federal oversight. And we know states don't like federal oversight. But sometimes, as we've seen with civil rights, as we've seen with LGBTQ rights, as we've seen with women reproductive rights, federal oversight is a reason why we've been able to move the needle and to be more inclusive and to be more American, if you will, is we have seen federal oversight. So look, the federal government doesn't wish to act, but sometimes it's necessary in order to ensure the strength of the votes, of voting rights, civil rights, and other kinds of rights of equality, democratic rights with a small d. So disinformation about absentee voting and voter fraud, which spread rampantly throughout the 2020 election, resulted in a very concerted effort made by certain states to really put the nail in the coffin. We saw longer lines since Shelby versus Holder. In fact, Maricopa County, Arizona, not the Deep South, prior to the Shelby versus Holder decision in 2013, had 800 polling stations. After Shelby, it was reduced almost in half to 400, and that was in 2014 election. By the 2018 election, the reason why we saw such long lines in that midterm election and long lines in the 2020 elections is that all of a sudden they've now shrunk it down to over a little bit over 100 polling stations. So you go from 800 polling stations to 100 polling stations in the span of 10 years. And, that's why you see the long lines. And then you see states like Georgia who want to allow cutoff of early voting and no Sunday voting, and to actually put you in jail if you give water or food to someone standing in line. Limiting the ability to have drop boxes for absentee balloting. The list goes on and on. And so what HR 4 would do would provide that federal oversight. Now combine that with HR 1, which I know you're going to speak about, Sean. And what we would have is a much more democratic, with a small d, ability for Americans to truly participate in the American process. After all, it is your voice. Your vote is your voice. And no one's voice should be silenced in any election, let alone be silenced by elected officials who have seen the advantages that they can accrue by having less people vote. We saw in North Dakota, for example, in 2018, these are not southern states. These are, every state. But North Dakota actually their state legislature put in a rule in 2018 that in order to register to vote, you had to have a physical address. A P.O. box would not do. And that was not surprisingly limiting for those who live on Indian country in North Dakota, where most of them have P.O. boxes. So being discriminatory, having a discriminatory impact disproportionately on Native Americans is cause for concern for that piece of legislation. And so I think that now more than ever, we need to heed the voice of John Lewis, who so eloquently fought and died, but always said that the vote is almost sacred. It is the most important nonviolent tool in our democracy, and we must use it, as he would say. And so I'd love to have an ongoing dialogue about this. I just want you to know that as a daughter of Selma, having grown up in Brown Chapel AME Church, which is a church that the marchers gathered before they crossed that bridge, not one time, but 3 times, because we know that it took 3 attempts before they actually had the march from Selma to Montgomery. I grew up in a church that every year those foot soldiers would come back and commemorate, remind us all of Bloody Sunday and the sacrifices that ordinary Americans did for extraordinary social change. So it is important for me not only to continue to fight for my current constituents, but for me to also acknowledge and advance the legacy of my district. And that legacy is a legacy, a very strong legacy of activism, of civic engagement, of nonviolent political engagement that has always achieved extraordinary social change. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you why I think federal oversight is still important. And I know that in the coming weeks, we will continue to have hearings on the Judiciary Committee to continue to build that case for why federal oversight is still necessary. And once that those experts have spoken up and we have the proof positive that federal oversight is needed, we will be filing H.R. 4, and hopefully we'll get it to the president's desk before the end of the year to sign. So the schedule as it stands now is a series of hearings will go on end of April through the summer. We will file our bill when we come back after summer recess, and then it's on. I hope it will not stall in the Senate as H.R. 1 has stalled in the Senate. I think that we have a lot to do with putting pressure on our senators. I know your senator, Senator Durbin, is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. So you folks from Illinois carry a lot of weight. If ever there's a reason to reform the filibuster in the Senate, I think it has to do with these very important bills that really do impact our democracy and making sure that we have free and fair elections and that all Americans who are eligible have a right to vote. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Terri. People often ask me, what do I really like about being a member of Congress? And you realize that we have 435 just experts who are experts, and everybody's an expert on something, and it's just a pleasure to sit here and learn from you and all your expertise, and just so grateful to be able to call you a colleague. I got to think about how to add something useful, and I don't have your experience. I don't have your experience as a lawyer. I don't have your experience in election law. I'm just a chemical engineer who decided to run for Congress, and I've been here now for 2 years and a little bit. One of the things that I think consistently strikes me as a newbie to this job is, why is it so hard to pass laws that overwhelming majorities of people support? And I want to just dwell on that for a minute, because I think it's important to understand why this is politically hard. If you go out and you ask people, should everybody in this country have a right to vote? Yeah, nobody disagrees with that. Should the person who wins an election be the person who was supported by the majority of the people who voted? Yeah, nobody really has any disagreement with that. If you move to some of the provisions of H.R. 1, should politicians spend their time doing their work for the people, or should they spend their time raising money? I don't think you get a lot of disagreement about that, and H.R. 1 has reforms to our campaign finance system to fix that. If you ask people, should should we politicians get to decide the shape of our districts and pick our voters, or should the voters pick us? You know, should we get rid of gerrymandering? That's pretty slam dunk as well. I mean, I'm not saying nobody disagrees with this, but overwhelming majorities, you know, bipartisan majorities, certainly bipartisan majorities of voters support those things. Should we hold ourselves as elected officials to higher ethical standards and not take outside employment and get other, you know, have to disclose where we might have some conflicts of interest? Should we undo some of the effects of Citizens United that gave corporations, you know, the ability not only to influence elections, but to disguise who they even are, so you don't even know who's influencing? All those things are overwhelmingly popular. And yet here we are sitting here saying we don't know how to get these things done and signed into the law and through the Senate because they've become such political lightning rods. And what I'd suggest to you is that this is a tension that is baked into our country. Our founders at their core, I mean, I think it's worth reminding ourselves the amazing hubris that our founders had in this idea when all the models of government they had were people who were kings and had royal blood or were descended from gods, or at least claimed to be. And they said, you know what, we're just going to put ordinary men, well, they didn't say women. Eventually we got to that, but we're just going to put ordinary men.
Black people either. We got to that too.
I'm going to get to that.
This country is always in search of being a
exactly, striving for more perfection. But they basically had this idea that said, we're going to put ordinary people, we're going to give them authority, and you, the people, are going to consent to be governed by people who are no different from you. And you're going to consent to be governed because they are going to respect the will of the majority. And that's worked, you know, not perfectly. It's worked for, you know, almost 250 years now. And the amazing irony of all this is, you know, when we were down in Montgomery together, I remember, who was the gentleman? There were so many amazing people down there. Oh, it was Brian, but John Meacham made the comment that
historian.
that the amazing thing about our founders is that none of them lived up to the vision that they described. They had
some of them were
slaves.
slave owners.
Yeah, exactly. They owned slaves. They couldn't imagine women voting. They themselves were afraid of majority. Read the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. There was this big debate that they had about, could we really trust a government that was just subject to the will of the people? Do we trust the people that much? And I don't care what side of the political aisle you're on. I got a lot of friends on the left who look at California's referendum system and say, I'm not sure I trust the will of the people on, you know, on substantive issues of policy as well. It is tricky, right?
Yeah.
And so we've built this system where the consent of the governed depends on expressing the will of the majority. But we have never lived in a country, and probably never will, where 100% of the population is willing to be governed by the will of the majority. What they're willing to do is to consent to be governed by people who will hold themselves to a higher ethical standard. And I think it's incumbent on us as elected officials to always live up to that higher standard and be held accountable when we don't. And to give you some sense of how these things tie together, I want to tell you the story of Ulysses S. Grant and Edward Brooke. U.S. Grant, you probably know. Edward Brooke, you may not. U.S. Grant, you know, won the Civil War, you know, marched to the sea, completely, you know, left the South in ruins. And when he was first elected president, he overwhelmingly won the majority of the southern states. Overwhelmingly, wasn't even close. He actually won the southern states by a bigger margin than he won the northern states. And that usually makes people scratch their head a little bit. Edward Brooke was the third African-American senator to ever serve, represented Massachusetts in 1967. The reason why I say those two things are connected is the thing that surprises, the thing that makes you scratch your head about why U.S. Grant won the South is the same reason that the third African-American senator was from Massachusetts in 1967, which is that the South was majority African-American. They were pretty psyched that the North had won the Civil War. And so the first two African-American senators were right after that.
That was
Hiram Peters from Mississippi, Blanche Bruce, Mississippi, 1870.
Actually, and Alabama had Benjamin Sterling Turner, who was also the first African-American. He was from Selma, like me.
Yeah, I think there were 6 members of Congress right after Reconstruction, or at the House, and
they were from
2
southern
senators.
states.
Yeah, also it was at Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, Texas,
South
Virginia.
Carolina. You know, I'm sure Clyburn's told us all about rebels. Yeah, we all know about it.
Exactly. And the point is that for this brief moment, we were a country where the will of the majority of men, we still didn't have women's suffrage, but where the will of the majority of men was reflected. And the minority got real nervous about that. And so that led to the Jim Crow era and lynchings. And you read about the Rutherford B. Hayes election, where precincts that had had massive turnout before, not a single person turned out. And the night before the election, 20 black men were shot and their bodies were drug out in the street so that people could see them on the way to the polling place, and they get a very clear message about what would happen if you voted. And so you saw this massive suppression of African-American turnout. And again, from 1875 till 1967, there was not a single African-American senator. And it's not coincidental, 1967, the civil rights era, and all the good trouble that happened down in your neck of the woods that brought that through. And there is a thread in our history that goes from the barrel of the gun in the Jim Crow era to poll taxes and literacy tests, to Soviet disinformation campaigns, to bottles of water in Georgia right now. And the thread of that is that if you want to change the outcome of a US election, it's really labor and cost ineffective to try to change individual votes. I mean, think about your own vote as you go to the, you show up at your precinct polling place. Today is municipal election day in Illinois. A lot of you have probably voted today. When you went to your polling places, how many different forms of the ballot were on the table? Because you lived in one area and there was a different, highway commissioner in your district than your neighbor because of where the district lines, different school boards. You got all these different ballots. You got different voting machinery from spot to spot. We're all on the voting rolls. If you vote once, it's going to be hard to forge someone else's vote because you've already been registered as voting. And so if you would actually change a vote, change the outcome of an election by changing individual votes, it's really time and labor intensive, and it's really easy to get caught. If, on the other hand, you can, through coercive pressure or social pressure or otherwise, or just by making really long lines,
or legislative decisions. I mean, I think that's so interesting is that I'm not saying that you shouldn't show an ID in order to go and vote. It's what kind of ID. In Alabama, after the Shelby versus Holder decision, before the Shelby versus Holder decision, they had 15 kinds of IDs that you could show, including a university student ID, including how my dad voted the latter parts of his life. He was wheelchair bound, so he voted with a validly issued Social Security ID. And the Social Security card is a federal ID with no picture, but it is an official form of ID. And you used to be able to vote with a utility bill. Well, then all of a sudden, Shelby versus Holder, we decided we have to have a photo ID. And so it's okay to show the photo ID of your hunting license and your fishing license, but not a university ID. I mean, you're making choices of who's in and who's out based on, being able to disenfranchise huge swaths of people, to your point.
Exactly. And that's historically the way that we have changed the outcomes of elections. And so for those of us, and I know all of us on this call and folks watching, if you love our democracy, if you love this idea that our founders had, as imperfect as they were, but they described a more perfect union and they set the goal for us to do it, then you have to always be vigilant about the fact that we are never going to be a country where everybody is happy with the will of the majority. Thomas Jefferson talked about it, the tyranny of the majority. We've always got to protect against that. But the minute we stop defending that is the minute this beautiful experiment falls apart. And so, thank you, Terri, for all you're doing, fighting this on the HR 4 side. We've talked about HR 1, and do just keep in mind that all of these things, this is the will of the majority that's looking to be protected, because that's the idea that our founders had.
What's really interesting is that people, when you think about it, because I represent a southern district that is one of the poorest districts in America. Birmingham is the biggest city, so it's the biggest city in Alabama, it's the biggest city in my district. But the reality is that I have folks in my district who don't have a passport, who depend on public transportation, so they don't have a driver's license. So the major forms of ID that people have to show, there are segments of the population, the disabled, senior citizens, that will find it harder to vote if state legislatures impose decisions about what kinds of ID can be presented And likewise, how could you justify not being able to give water and food to people who are standing in line trying to exercise their right to vote? I don't know if you saw the Sunday shows, but Republican legislators could not explain that one. Yet it passed. It's signed by the governor of Georgia, and they wouldn't even let one of the Black state legislatures in the door. This is a woman who was duly elected by constituents from Georgia, a state legislator who just wanted to be in there to witness the signature of the governor.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know about you, but when I saw that tape, when I heard about these, 41, my notes say 43 states have over 250 more restrictive laws that they're now trying to impose because of the 2020 presidential election. Now, why would they do it now when the 2020 election saw the most votes ever? The Republican got the most votes ever. The Democrat got the most votes ever. We should be celebrating that it was such a fair and free election that so many people voted.
Yeah, and 62 courts affirmed that it was a fair election.
Right. And here's the thing. 60 court cases, most thrown out. All of them thrown out. Just one or two that actually got a hearing. What I'm saying is that we cannot buy into the big lie that somehow the 2020 election was a farce or that fraud runs rampant. Study after study after study has shown that the incidence of fraud, voter fraud going on is so minuscule, whereas the effects of restrictive laws are much more egregious. They are voter suppression laws. So voter suppression is the problem. Let's figure out how we can make it easier for people to vote. You look at Oregon that has vote by mail and 70% of the people participate. What's wrong with that? Nothing is wrong with that. I mean, instead of
troops overseas.
Yeah. And so I think that, for me, talking to my young interns and trying to get them to care about voting rights and to see the power of their vote and how important the youth vote is. We saw that this past election. People, I think, really saw that your vote does matter. And when you do vote, you can change election outcomes. I mean, look at Georgia. I would have never in my lifetime thought that Georgia would be blue, let alone that Georgia would have 2 Democratic senators, one Jewish and one Black.
Yeah.
I say, God bless America. Isn't that amazing?
And that so many people voted, right? I mean,
And
regardless of whether you liked the person who you voted for, you didn't like the person who won. One of the things that COVID did, and it did it here in Illinois too, is we were forced to think about how to make it easier to vote.
Yeah.
Not less responsible, but more early voting times. Make vote by mail easier, and still with all the protections. And we had a good and fair election. Let's open up. I know I see the chat's at 36 right now or something like that. So let's turn over to our moderators here and see what questions are coming in that we can answer.
Sounds great.
Sure. Rep. Sewell, I realize you've addressed the changes in what kind of IDs were acceptable to vote, but we still have a number of people questioning why is requiring voter ID considered voter suppression?
So it's the types of IDs that are being required. You're picking winners and losers. The example that I gave of Alabama is a real world example. I am not saying that you don't, to be able to get a ballot, you need to show that you are a citizen of that district. And so being able to show who you are and to be on the voter roll is important. And no one is saying that it's not. What I'm saying is that we should be able to provide lots of kinds of IDs, make it easier for people to be able to show an ID. But when the state of Alabama went from 15 IDs to 8 IDs, and they took away some of the things that were easy to show, like a utility bill that showed your name as it appears on the voter roll and your address, a water bill, an electric bill. That used to be one of them, and it was for 50 years. Now, all of a sudden, they have a list, and that list first of all, it must have a photo. Secondly, they choose, hunting licenses and fishing licenses. So they're showing a penchant for fishermen and people who hunt, but then they won't let a university photo ID from a university be shown. That you're picking winners and losers on who can vote. And I'm sorry, voting is a matter of a right, a fundamental right of our citizenship in this great country. And so, I am not saying that showing an ID is wrong. In and of itself, that is not voter suppression. But when state legislatures specifically restrict the list in ways that have a discriminatory impact on certain segments of the population by requiring a photo ID and assuming everybody has a driver's license, which is the most popular form of photo ID, for those who are disabled or senior citizens. My dad, who drove a car for 80 years, but the latter part of his life was in a wheelchair, could not drive, therefore his no longer valid driver's license, wasn't traveling, no longer had a valid passport. All of a sudden he could not vote with his Social Security card. He's lived in the same house, in the same street, vote at the same polling station. He was highly motivated to go vote after the Shelby versus Holder decision because I was on the ballot in 2014 and 2018 and 16. And so, look, I think that we should just think to ourselves about why it is we're trying to impose more restrictive laws, putting up barriers to senior citizens being able to vote, students being able to vote. We're disenfranchising groups of people, and by doing so, we're making it harder for our election process to work as it's supposed to, which is that anyone who is eligible, a citizen eligible to vote over the age of 18, who is registered as a voter. We already have requirements. You got to be American. You got to be over 18. You got to have already pre-registered. In my state, we don't have early voting. The state of Alabama, you can only vote on a Tuesday, and all elections are held on a Tuesday, and the polling station is open 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. No early voting. And if you want to vote absentee, you must have an excuse. So we don't have no excuse absentee voting, which a lot of states do. There's a theory that election law is all local because all politics are local, and so the state knows best. So the state establishes how they do it, except for federal elections. And that's where we, the federal government, have some purview to pass laws that affect the ability of federal elections and how those are conducted.
Can I just make a math point quick? Because I'm grateful for all that, but I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that you measure the results of these policies not by does it make sense, but is there disparate impact? And if you look over the course of our history, you basically got, at a statistical level, no meaningful evidence of fraud where people are voting illegally, not shown. They're trivial. They're such rounding errors that they don't matter. We do, however, know that when you ask for IDs, you will differentially lead to a reduction in turnout among people who are younger, who are less likely to have IDs, less likely to have passports, less likely to own a car. All those sorts of things. You disenfranchise people who skew young, skew poor, which means that you disenfranchise the interests of the youth and people who skew poor and minority populations. And so if your purpose is to ensure we have a robust ballot election, that's not a defense of that any more than, I know all of you got your computers open. Go Google, literacy tests that were used in the South during the Jim Crow era. You can't even understand them. I read them. I'm like, I'd fail this test every time.
Or in Alabama,
they didn't use that test in my neighborhood.
If you saw the movie Selma, there they were standing there in Dallas County, the courthouse, right across from the federal courthouse where my office is, but the courthouse where I got my driver's test, the Dallas County courthouse. It used to be that you had to recite all 67 counties of Alabama in order to simply register to vote.
Yeah, and I'll bet you didn't have to do that in the rich white part of Alabama, right? So the ID question, while on its face it sounds reasonable in the same way of saying, well, shouldn't people have to read to be able to vote? It sounds reasonable on its face, but if you look at the impact, the impact is to, in a very surgical way, disenfranchise certain groups of people without actually changing the integrity of an election. So be focused on integrity of elections without question, but don't fall for the story that story. And that's, to come back to what I said before, the ways that people change the outcome of elections in this country historically is by making sure that certain blocks of people don't come to the polling place in the first place. It's not that there is fraud at the ballot box, because that's just too labor intensive.
Next question.
Right, I'm rephrasing this from several comments, but how do we restore faith in election security when so many Americans believe that the last election was unfair?
I would challenge the assertion. I mean, look, there were, well, look, Terry and I both lived through people storming the Capitol who thought that the election was unfair. But I got to remind everybody, that was a minority of a minority of a minority. That wasn't the majority of Trump voters. It wasn't the majority of Republicans. And as I said in my opening remarks, we have always had people in our country who are not comfortable with the idea that they would be governed by the will of the majority. That is fundamentally different from saying, I don't believe the election was fair. Because look, we've got colleagues who challenged the results of states where they were on the ballot and they won the election. Not a one of them came up and said, the election in my state of Arizona was fraudulent, and therefore I shouldn't be here to vote on whether this election was fraudulent. They weren't asserting that the election was fraudulent. They were asserting that they didn't like the result of one of those line items on the ballot. And so I think it's incumbent on us, not just us as members of Congress, but on all of us to say, separate whether or not the person you voted for won and whether you're happy with that person from, do we trust the integrity of our democracy? And do keep in mind, I want to make this completely separate from issues of race in HR 1. When we got the debriefs, not classified debriefs, but debriefs from people in our intelligence services about what happened in the 2016 election and Russian interference, what was very clear is that they said that the Russians cannot compete with the US economically. They cannot compete with the US in terms of our moral standing in the world. And it is in their strategic interest to bring us down to their level. And so the Russian disinformation campaign that happened in 2016 was expressly targeted to persuade Americans that you can't trust the integrity of your elections, because if you don't trust our democracy, we might drag ourselves down to Russian levels. And that Russian disinformation campaign wasn't just people saying, vote for Trump, we like Trump. That Russian disinformation campaign was actually funding a lot of accounts that looked like Black Lives Matter accounts. There was an account called Woke Louisa, if you go and Google it, where this Woke Louisa was saying you can't trust anybody in politics because of all this history of discrimination against minorities, and just don't get involved in the process. And that account was run by a Russian GRU agent. It's since been shut down, but you can still see it linked to. So be very leery of people telling you not to trust our democracy, right, because that is in Russia's national policy interest, and they are behind a lot of that agenda. Sorry, Terry, go ahead.
No. What I was going to say, I sat on the Intel committee during that time, and I can tell you for a fact that sowing seeds of discord, trying to pit Blacks versus whites, Southerners versus Northerners. I mean, it was an effort by which to bring down our democracy, is to try to intimidate, and to also for us to even be having this discussion about the integrity. It is to make us question whether or not our democracy is the best government. And let's be very clear, I'm a Southern Democrat, and I, like Sean, am a pro-business Democrat, pro-growth Democrat. And, the efforts were made to try to paint with a very broad brush all Democrats to be socialist. And, all of those efforts were to sow seeds of discord. So I agree with you 100% that we have to fight back against this feeling that somehow people don't have confidence. The majority of the people don't have confidence in our elections.
Yeah, the courts ruled it was a free and fair election, right? And the majority of people did as well. Just because you read it on Facebook doesn't mean it's true.
Next question.
Thank you. Theodora on Zoom pointed out regarding the Georgia law that water would not be necessary for voters if they didn't have to wait in lines for 8 hours. What can be done about this form of voter suppression, these 8-hour long lines?
have more polling stations, give people advance notice of where these polling stations will be. The reality is that, as I gave you an example of Maricopa County, Arizona, where they really restricted the number of voting places, it used to be because that particular county of Arizona was a covered jurisdiction. That would have never happened without federal oversight. If we had federal oversight, then they would have not been able to go from 800 polling stations to less than 100. So I think what we can do is pass the Voter Empowerment Act, which is included in HR 1, and that act would make it possible to have numbers of more polling stations, a requirement based on population. That's one of the things that's in the Voter Empowerment Act. The Voter Empowerment Act would also have automatic registration at 18 when you go to the DMV and get your driver's license. The Voter Empowerment Act would also, it's all about trying to facilitate and make it easier for people to vote. So we can pass HR 1, we can pass HR 4 when it's submitted on the floor. Those two would go a long way to limiting the restrictive nature of some states who are trying to limit people's ability to vote.
I want to just make a comment, and this will, I'm suspecting there's probably more people from my district than yours on this Facebook Live just because of how we marketed it, Terry, but the 6th District in Illinois is 83% white. I'm going to guess most of the people on this call didn't really have much in the way of voting lines when they went and voted today or when they voted in November. And we recently had, and I'm trying to remember, it was some big time election lawyer, you may have been on the call, trust me, they were smart. They looked at the national data in the 2020 election and found that the average waiting time for a Black person to vote was 56 minutes. The average waiting time for a white person was 6 minutes. And they then drilled down, so that's national across the whole country. They then drilled down and they just picked Fulton County at random and said, Fulton County, Georgia, Atlanta. Within Fulton County, it was still that same 10-to-1 ratio. And so this is a very surgical, very intentional effort. And if you're like me living in Downers Grove, Illinois, I didn't really have much of a wait. I showed up and I voted, and I'm guessing a lot of people on this call didn't as well. Not to say that there aren't bottlenecks in the system, but those polling place delays have been surgically placed in areas that are surgically designed to disenfranchise certain groups of people. And it's not pleasant. We might not like to talk about it, but the first step in the 12-step process is to admit you have a problem. And we got to admit it.
We do. I mean, I'm not saying that all states are bad actors. I am saying that, when we have these laws like North Dakota, where you're literally the impact of the disparate impact of that law that to register to vote, you have to have a physical address. It had a disproportionate effect on Native Americans, and that was wrong. That was wrong. And so, I think that, Sean, what you said is absolutely right. And I think about my constituents in Alabama. I voted absentee because everyone had the excuse of fearing for their life and a health excuse passed because of the pandemic. Alabama voters overwhelmingly, lots of people voted through absentee ballot. And so you would think that my state would say, so more people voted because they were able to, didn't have to have an excuse, or the excuse, was accepted to say because you were of illness, that we would somehow now go to no excuse absentee balloting as being a great way to increase the turnout and the ability of people to vote. But,
Yeah. And do keep in mind that turnout is not partisan, right? Turnout is just pro lowercase d democracy. The single largest group of first-time voters in the last election was white men without a college degree. Those generally tended to skew Republican, right? But a lot of those people were also voting because, as I said at the start, we made it easy to vote in the last election. I'm going to guess, Terry, you tell me if I'm wrong. I'm going to guess that turnout was probably at a record high in Alabama as well. And I'm guessing it skewed pretty Republican.
Oh, we're a red state in Alabama.
So you don't.
Thank God for my district, which, by the way, is a voting rights district. I mean, Alabama is 26% African American, and it was only after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that really guaranteed the rights of minorities. And I say minorities with a small m, because today's majority population may be tomorrow's minority population. And the browning of America is real. And maybe that's what people are afraid of. I really don't know why, but I can tell you that the impact of these more restrictive voter laws is to disenfranchise certain groups of people. And we shouldn't be about the business of disenfranchising anyone who is legitimately able and lawfully can vote.
Thanks. Again, I'm combining a number of comments, but we have a fair amount of viewers who are asking how HR 1 and HR 4 will be funded.
So I can talk about HR 4, and it is obviously funded by, well, we all have, there is no cost of ours, although you and I both know the Justice Department enforceability arm is paid for by our tax dollars. So ours is not, this particular bill is about enforcement and is a remedy for egregious state actors or jurisdictional actors that have sought to discriminate. It's such a misnomer to assume that we are increasing that we're costing a lot of money to just put back in force and full force and effect section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Right now, without section 4, there is no section 5 enforcement. And so it's about enforcement of voter laws, election laws.
Yeah, and I think in general, these are not bills that have big price tags that are where the funding is really material. I mean, we could ask, like, how is any enforcement agency funded? Like, why do we have an attorney general if you have to pay for it? Well, because we think it's important to live in a country where we enforce the laws, and we're going to need some people to do that because the cost of not enforcing the laws exceeds the cost of doing that. But we don't necessarily talk about, it's fiscally irresponsible to have an attorney general. The same way,
my bill doesn't have a CBO score.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, there are pieces in HR 1 that do require funding. So we provide, I think it's $150,000, if my memory is right, per congressional district to every state in order to create nonpartisan entities to create redistricting maps on a nonpartisan basis. And so we've provided a sweetener to give the states the incentives to create that and to recognize that there's some cost that they have to do that. That's not funded. Now, I would argue as a voter, not as a member of Congress, that I would rather know that my representative has to represent everybody rather than just the people they chose to represent, and the gain to our society from having more inclusive voices at the table offsets that. You may disagree, but if that's the case, color me anti-gerrymander and we'll move on. The big piece in HR 1 is the public financing of campaigns. And so what we've said there is that in order to increase the voices of small dollar contributors to campaign, and this is a program that New York City has implemented with some success, we will provide a 6-to-1 federal match for all small dollar donors. I think it's $250 or less. And so the idea is to create greater incentives for people running for office to talk to people who don't have the ability to write $2,900 checks, which is the maximum you can give to a campaign. And then, of course, there's also getting rid of some of the dark money, which is frankly the much more pernicious problem. Now, that does create a meaningful funding problem. And so, when you look at like what races cost, that can be a pretty big number. We've put a provision in where that is funded by certain fines paid by corporations that violate election law. And the math all works out. So it's equal funding just between, you, me, Terry, and whoever happens to be listening on this. My personal view is that that's a little bit too cute by half. I'd prefer to not have companies breaking the law that had to pay fines than require that does fines. But it is a pay for that's been put in there. The reason why I say it's a little bit too cute by half, and this is really, we can have differences of opinion on this. Every hour that members of Congress spend raising money is an hour they don't spend thinking about how to do the work of the people. And I think a government where members can spend more of their time doing the work of the people is a work where we're going to have much more effective government. We're going to have more collegial because we'll spend more time getting to know each other. And I think the gains from that, while I can't claim to quantify them, but I'm pretty confident they outweigh the costs.
Thanks. I have one final question before I open up to your final remarks. And constituents and viewers are asking what they can do to help get these bills passed.
Try to get your senators and your representatives to vote for it. I'm willing to guess that maybe that your senators would probably vote for it, but we really do need the HR 1 has already passed the House. HR 4 has enough signers on it, co-sponsors of the legislation to pass the House. It'll really be the Senate, and I really think that we should correct people when they say, oh, having an ID, these people who are talking about voting rights, they're talking about no IDs, and we're not saying that. I think that we need to understand that certain laws on their face may look like they are not discriminatory, but when they have a discriminatory impact on certain segments of the society that can lawfully vote, then I think that we should open our eyes to see that federal oversight may be necessary for certain bad actors. And all I'm asking for HR 4 is for Congress to put the teeth back in the enforceability arm by allowing by voting for a formula, and we can have a healthy debate about what's in that formula, which is why the evidentiary hearings and all the evidence that has been collected since the Shelby versus Holder decision will be very impactful as to what actually is going to be in that law. But I think that I'm very happy that someone asked the question, what can average people do besides vote? They can also participate in our political process. And that participation is advocating for the policies and the solutions that you think are good. I mean, look, I think that there's nothing better for me than to go to host town hall meetings. And I know you, Sean, we've been doing them virtually these days, and to hear directly from my constituents. An engaged electorate is a voting electorate that, and I think that the best ideas come from when the table is inclusive of all voices.
We've made it this far without saying the word filibuster, so I'm going to say filibuster because you're right. I think our 2 Illinois senators are supportive of the bill, but we need to have.
You can write mine. My 2 senators are not.
Well, I just want to have a conversation about the filibuster, and maybe this is a chance to tie everything together and then leave you with some closing remarks as well. I keep coming back to this idea that our founders didn't really trust a majority rule, even though they aspired to that more perfect union where we would be ruled by the will of the majority. The Senate is not a majoritarian institution. I represent 740,000 people in Illinois' 6th district. There are about 510,000 people who live in the entire state of Wyoming, and they get 1 member of Congress and 2 senators. They are massively more represented in the Senate than you are on this call, because of the structure of our founders. And by the way, our founders didn't even allow senators to be elected by the people. They were supposed to be appointed by, enlightened state legislators. That shows how much our founders trusted you all, right? The filibuster was not in the Constitution. The founders didn't put it there. It was created during really in the aftermath of the Civil War. And we can get all caught up in these words, but I got to explain to you how the process works in the House. We go to the floor, Terry's got a big bill. She's leading HR 4. She says, the speaker, I'd like an hour of time for debate, 30 minutes allocated to each side to debate. Chair says, all right, I'll grant you the time, and you debate for an hour. And at the end, you say, do you want any more time? And somebody says, no, I want to call the question, which means we want to vote on the bill. And if the majority of the members of the House say, yeah, it's time to stop debating and vote, then we stop debate, and then we go vote. And the vote passes or it doesn't pass. And it passes by simple majority. In the Senate, votes also pass just by simple majority. It's no different. The difference is that in the Senate, when you get to that question of saying, should we stop debating? The Senate says you can't do that unless you have a supermajority. You need 60 people to decide to stop debating. That's not anything our founders contemplated. It's frankly a really dumb rule the Senate came up with in the Reconstruction era, because they were petrified of a world where they might have to be accountable to the majority. And the whole history of the filibuster is tied up in all these issues of slavery and civil rights. That's why it's there. And so now if you ask yourself, okay, what would it take to get 40 senators to block a bill? If you take the 20 smallest states in the country, they got 40 senators. They represent 10% of the population of the United States. That ain't what our founders intended. And so, you know, does that mean we need to totally get rid of the filibuster? Does that mean we need to go back to something where you actually have to continue to debate, which we don't do anymore? They've taken that rule away. Does that mean that maybe, as our colleague John Sarbanes has suggested, maybe we say for legislation that is expressly designed to protect the will of the majority, we can't allow that type of legislation to be blocked by a minority? You know, and I don't know, there's people way smarter than me on Senate procedure. I think what you can do to help is, you know, get educated on the filibuster and do put some pressure. I don't know whether your Senate delegation is on that issue. I apologize for the dog in the background. But do put some pressure, because there is no good reason that our founders didn't know what the filibuster was. This is a late edition, and I think it's long past its shelf date. So thank you all for doing this. Terri, thank you for doing this, and I'll leave you and your wisdom with the last word.
Well, I just want to thank you, Sean, for the opportunity to speak to your constituents. Again, he's a phenomenal congressman, and you've done well in having him represent you at the table. It's been a pleasure to be your colleague. I consider you to be my friend, and thank you for the opportunity just to talk about voting rights. I'm going to just close with words that are way better than mine, and that's the words of John Lewis, who is so beloved. He's earned the respect of this nation by his courage, but it is his conviction and his belief in a beloved community where everyone has a stake in this great country that is so profound. And so in closing, I'd like to just quote John Lewis. If you see something that's not fair, that's not right, that's not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. We must keep the faith, even in the midst of trials, and we must remember to always vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Terri. Thank you to everybody who participated. Stay safe, everybody.